welcome to our event this evening. I'm Professor Joseph Massad here at Columbia University from the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. Our event this evening is sponsored by the International Socialist Organization, the Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies here at Columbia University. Our speaker for the evening, Ali Abunimah, is probably well known to most of you. He is the author of One Country, A Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse, and co-founder and director of the widely acclaimed publication, The Electronic Intifada. Ali will speak to us this evening about his brilliant new book titled The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Please help me welcome him to our campus.
Good evening, everyone, and first let me thank all the co-sponsors of this event and thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's tremendous to see so many people, and I would like to thank Professor Joseph Massad for your very kind and warm remarks and introduction, and for so much more than that. As I wrote in the acknowledgements of the book, you played an important part in the book, but I didn't say enough in the book. I'm going to say more now. That you personally, your ethical commitment, your clear moral principles, your courage in the face of intimidation, your empathy with the oppressed, your commitment to fighting racism and anti-Semitism in all its forms, all of these, as anyone who reads the book will know, have inspired me, and your name appears throughout the book as a testament to the enormity of the contribution you've made and to this cause, to learning, and to me personally. And I'm very proud to be able to say that here at this institution. Thank you. This book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, comes at a moment when I think many people are wondering what comes next. Today, by the way, I want to congratulate everyone on the end of the peace process. But of course, as we know, the peace process never ends. It's a case of the peace process is dead, long live the peace process. But we have undoubtedly reached a moment when it's getting harder and harder for people to pretend that there is a negotiation in place that will lead to some kind of outcome that would bring about the stated slogan, 2 states living side by side in peace. And in fact, we see the discourse in the United States heading in ever more absurd directions. You may have heard that the scandal of the past few days, on Friday, Secretary of State John Kerry was recorded in a meeting of the Trilateral Commission. I thought that, I didn't think that existed. I thought it was one of these things that, conspiracy theorists are always going on about. But apparently the secret cabal actually exists. And so he was recorded in the Trilateral Commission predicting that Israel would become an apartheid state at some indeterminate point in the future. If there were no 2-state solution. Of course, this is ridiculous for a number of reasons, because it posits apartheid as a future condition and not as the present reality that millions of people face. But what is more significant, of course, Kerry is not opposed to Israeli apartheid. He is opposed to Israeli apartheid being visible and being named. And so his concern and what he was urging the members of this secret cabal is that a 2-state solution should be brought about as quickly as possible to legitimize Israel as a so-called Jewish state, because otherwise the alternative, which he cited with horror, would be a unitary state in which everyone has equal rights. And he said the only way to prevent this nightmare is to proceed to a 2-state solution as quickly as possible. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. But what's been so interesting is the backlash. Kerry was forced to apologize in a very abject and craven way for using the word apartheid. But in his apology, he said something very interesting. He said that although Israeli leaders have commonly used the term apartheid, Israeli leaders, including former prime ministers, but also Israeli media commentators, have frequently used the term apartheid, he said that the term is better left out of the debate here at home. So in other words, what he's saying is that American politicians and American leaders should be more censored in discussing Israel than Israelis themselves. Now, this has always been the case. Those who read Israeli media regularly will find that the scope for discussion, although Israeli media tends to be, like American media, very ultra-nationalist and even fascistic, yet you find space for criticism of Israel that is broader than you will find on the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. That's always been implicit, but this is the first time I can think of an American official explicitly saying that's how it should be. Israelis should be able to say things that we in America censor ourselves from saying. The absurdity, of course, is that the United States poses as an honest broker. And so you have to wonder how honest an honest broker could be who explicitly says that we will not name the things that exist, or we will not name the things we see. And of course it fits into the broader context that I address in the book, which is my opening statement in the book, the opening sentence is, the Palestinians are winning. And many people might think that that's a strange claim to make, given the reality for Palestinians on the ground in Gaza, where 1.7 million Palestinians live under siege, where they are facing a really brutal Israeli campaign of boycott and sanctions designed to reduce them and reduce the foundations of civilized life to rubble. It's something I was able to witness myself last year and write about in the book. You look at the West Bank, where Palestinians, the vast majority, live in poverty, while a very small elite, the Palestinian 1%, enrich themselves through their collaborationist relationships with the Palestinian Authority. That's a phenomenon I call neoliberal Palestine, write about in the book. The vast majority of Palestinians in the West Bank, of course, continue to suffer land loss, mass unemployment and poverty, and increasing dependence on international aid, which is turned on and off as a form of collective punishment and control. And then we might look at Palestinians in Syria, and the diaspora generally, but in Syria in particular, where more than half of the 350,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria have been displaced as a result of the brutal civil war in that country. And while they're suffering along with millions of Syrians, the proportion of Palestinians displaced is actually far higher than the proportion of Syrians displaced. So once again, Palestinians have been the victims of geopolitical realities and conflicts over which they have no control. And we've unfortunately seen this in the past in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and other places where Palestinian refugees have lived in large numbers. So you might think it a very odd claim to make that Palestinians are winning. But what I argue in the battle for justice in Palestine is that Palestinians are winning the argument. And I'm going to come to that in a second. I'm going to read a little section from the book. But really, a large part of what I examine in the book is the massive campaign that is being waged in the United States and around the world by Israel and its lobby groups to suppress and shut down an argument or a debate or a Palestine solidarity movement that Israel fears that it is losing. And this campaign has really been going on for 4 years now. I mean, it has a longer history, but I date the latest iteration to 2010, when an Israeli think tank with close ties to the military and political echelon called the Reut Institute issued a report saying that Israel, the main threat to Israel was no longer military, that Israel really doesn't face a physical threat to its existence, despite, of course, the propaganda about Iran and so on. But the cold, hard Israeli strategists conclude that actually there's really very little physical threat. The real threat is of Israel being delegitimized in the manner that South Africa was delegitimized. And so what they propose in the book, in 2010, is an Israeli government-led campaign of sabotage and attack. Those are the words that were used by the Reut Institute, targeting the Palestine solidarity movement around the world, and particularly in the United States, in what they call so-called hubs of delegitimization, which include New York, the Bay Area, unfortunately not Chicago. We've always been very miffed at our failure to achieve delegitimization hub status, although we've been competing for it for many years. I feel like I should ask Professor Meshad to write a recommendation, given all the kind things he said to me. But the serious side of this is that enormous resources, conservatively I would estimate tens of millions of dollars, have been expended to really create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation on campus in particular. And I'll just give you a few sort of examples from the book. I write about an organization called the David Project, which is a multi-million-dollar pro-Israel organization, or anti-Palestinian organization, if you like, whose goal is to suppress Palestine solidarity activism on campus, but also to suppress academic discussion and teaching about Palestine. A very important part of the local history is that really the David Project, which was founded in 2002, first came to prominence a decade ago with its campaign against Professor Meshad. And in the book I write about this campaign, which has really, I think, in one sense it's typical of what teachers and professors have faced around the country, but in another sense it's really unprecedented in its kind of vindictiveness and scope and targeting of Columbia University in general and Professor Meshad in particular. And I think an important part of the story I tell is the failure of Columbia as an institution to stand up, and I hope Professor Meshad won't mind me saying this, but I think it's important to point to the failure of Columbia to stand up for his rights in particular and for academic freedom in general. But far from singling out Columbia, the really sad part of the story is that when you survey American institutions in general, the ones that actually stand up for academic freedom are exceptional. I only came across, I think, one in the book, where a university president actually stood up and faced down attacks on faculty. This was the interim president of California State University, Northridge, who really stood up for faculty who were facing threats of lawsuits for essentially speaking their minds on the question of Palestine. In general, the atmosphere is one of institutional complicity and intimidation. What the couple of significant things about why what's happening on campus is so significant and why I focus on it in the book can be gleaned from the analysis the David Project itself offers. Now, an interesting point is that since they launched their most vicious early attacks on Columbia and on Professor Messad, they have tried to rebrand themselves as a sort of a kinder, gentler pro-Israel organization. But really in doing so, I think what their agenda has only become more insidious. But in one of their strategy papers, they make a very important point. They actually demolish the notion that has long been promoted by Zionist groups and that was their original claim against Columbia, that American college campuses are rife with anti-Semitism. Most American campuses are not hostile environments for most Jewish students, they say. Racial anti-Semitism of the kind most associated with the Nazis is not likely a serious problem on any American college campus. Claiming otherwise does not jive with the lived experience of many Jewish students who know they can identify as Jews and largely not suffer repercussions. Consequently, I'm still quoting from them, depicting campus as hostile to Jews has not to date proven to be an effective strategy for decreasing anti-Israelism. For anyone, now, end quote, for anyone committed to the struggle against racism in any form, the lack of anti-Semitism on campus can only be good news. But for Zionist organizations, it makes the campus environment a more challenging, though no less central, battleground. And to solve the problem posed by the absence of anti-Semitism, the David Project has promoted a new term, anti-Israelism, which it describes as, quote, a specific form of bigotry targeted against the modern state of Israel. And as I argue in the book, this redefinition is a crucial element in the effort to restrict campus discussions of Israel's racist practices or its claim to have a right to exist as a Jewish state. The significance of campus is further revealed by the David Project when they point out that in the rest of the world, Israel is generally unpopular, and that's something that you can find in any number of surveys. The BBC World Service does an annual survey that finds that Israel is consistently ranked at the bottom of public perceptions around the world, along with Iran, Pakistan, and North Korea. And that's particularly true in Western countries. Of course, the difference is not that there's some objective criteria by which Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan and Israel should all be lumped together. I think a significant difference is that whereas countries like Iran are the targets of consistent negative propaganda and negative media reporting, Israel is the subject of almost entirely positive reporting, and yet it's unable to exceed Iran's rankings in Western public opinion, except, of course, in the United States. And so in the rest of the world, the David Project argues, the battle is to simply prevent Israel turning into an international pariah akin to apartheid South Africa. In the United States, however, where support for Israel is still much broader and stronger, the battle is to maintain long-term two-party support. It's not good enough that we stop the US from becoming anti-Israel. We have to make sure the US remains pro-Israel. The long-term bipartisan support for a strong relationship between Israel and the United States cannot be assured if the environments of key universities and colleges are largely negative towards the Jewish state. And they actually argue that the battle to maintain US support for Israel in the long term will be won and lost on campus. And that's the context in which we can understand the intensity of the efforts I describe in the book to suppress debate on campus, which has included everything from bogus civil rights complaints filed with the federal government against a number of universities, including Barnard College, and a number of University of California campuses, and Rutgers. In the case of Barnard and several of the University of California cases, the federal government, and in the case of UC Berkeley, a federal judge, have thrown out those complaints and said that they're absolutely baseless. But the organizations behind them have said that, you win some, you lose some. The important thing, I'm paraphrasing, but not very much, is that we're putting students and faculty who want to cross the line on Israel, we're putting them through the ringer. And whether we win or lose, this kind of attack is so costly on them that will deter students from joining SJP groups, will deter faculty from stepping over the line. And in some ways it's working. I quote the former Middle East Studies Center at Rutgers saying that junior faculty at Rutgers are so intimidated by these kinds of tactics that they're afraid to mention the question of Palestine in class. So this kind of attack is underway. We've also seen efforts to criminalize Palestine solidarity activism. The most notorious case, of course, is the trial and conviction of the Irvine 11. 11 students from UC Irvine and UC Riverside who interrupted a speech by the then Israeli ambassador and an officer in the Israeli army, Michael Oren. And the part of the story that I think was overlooked in public was the complicity of the university in their prosecution. I think that the Orange County prosecutors were unfairly blamed. And when it was in fact the university that arrested them and forwarded the complaints to Orange County prosecutors and in effect demanded that its own students be prosecuted. So this attack comes, that's one of the more extreme examples, but recently we've seen, for example, the first case of a Students for Justice in Palestine group being banned outright, and that happened at Northeastern University in Boston. That ban was supposed to last until at least 2015, but because of the national uproar, particularly from students around the country, and threats of legal action by the students, the university was forced to rescind it. You might ask if public support for Israel is so strong, and if supporters of Israel feel that the shared values of Israel and the United States are so natural and so obvious to most Americans, why this enormous effort is needed. And the section that I want to read from the book, it's a couple of pages, comes from a chapter called "Does Israel Have a Right to Exist as a Jewish State?" And the significance of this question is that according to the David Project's definition of anti-Israelism, this chapter, the questions I pose, should be defined as bigotry, and you should immediately go from this lecture hall to the appropriate authorities in the university to say that I've committed an act of bigotry and made you feel unsafe, and that all those who are involved in bringing this event have been complicit in that, and disciplinary action should be taken. In other words, there is a serious effort to place what ought to be discourse and argument within the purview of disciplinary and juridical proceedings. That is I argue, the implication of the effort to redefine anti-Semitism, or to invent this new term anti-Israelism, to go beyond what we understand as being reprehensible anti-Jewish racism to including any discussion of Israel's political claims. So that's the context for this taste of the book. Given the centrality of Israel's claim, the question of whether Israel does indeed have a right to exist as a Jewish state deserves serious consideration. A useful lens through which to examine this proposition is the foundational legal maxim I cited at the beginning of this chapter, which I didn't read you, but I paraphrase it here. Put in simple terms, if a person bears a right, then there must be some venue, usually a court of law, where she can seek to have that right enforced, to have a penalty imposed on the violator, or to obtain some other form of legal relief. In the formulation of the 18th century jurist William Blackstone, it is a settled and invariable principle in the laws of England that every right, when withheld, must have a remedy, and every injury its proper redress. His insertion of the word proper reminds us that the remedy must be lawful and equitable. If my neighbor cuts down my tree, a proper remedy might include paying damages to me, replacing the tree, and perhaps some restraining order to prevent him from felling other trees. It would not be a proper remedy for me to vengefully cut down my neighbor's trees, demolish his house, or kill his children. Let us accept for the sake of argument that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, or to maintain its Jewish character, or Jewish and democratic character, to use other common formulations, and that this means in practice that Israel has a right to maintain a Jewish demographic majority. Let us also leave aside for now the fact that the Jewish majority within Israel's pre-1967 borders was created when Zionist militias, and later Israel, expelled most of the indigenous Palestinian population in 1947 and 48, and then prevented their return. First, how can Israel's right to maintain a Jewish majority be violated, and by whom? And by what means can Israel enforce it? There are three groups of Palestinians, broadly speaking, who represent a threat to Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Palestinian refugees in exile, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. There are also citizens of Syria still living in the occupied Golan Heights too, of course. Palestinian refugees could violate the right by returning home in sufficient numbers that the Jewish majority disappeared. The straightforward remedy Israel constantly demands is that the right of return be abrogated. But even if Palestinian refugees waived their rights and not a single one returned, this would be insufficient to protect Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state for very long, against an even more imminent threat from Palestinians already living in territories controlled by Israel. Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the occupied territories together comprise half the population living under Israeli rule. By some calculations, they're a slight majority, but for the sake of argument, let's say half. Simply put, Palestinian parents are trampling all over Israel's right to maintain a Jewish majority by having children, and their babies, by virtue of not being born to Jewish parents, are violating Israel's right merely by living and breathing. Israelis themselves see the births of non-Jewish babies, whether to Palestinian citizens of the state or in the occupied territories, as an assault on their rights and on the very existence of Israel. The routine use by politicians and media of the term demographic threat to describe Palestinian babies attests to this phenomenon. The most pungent expression of this fear, David Hurst reminds us, came from Golda Meir, who was Israeli Prime Minister in the 1970s. The Palestinians' birth rate was so much higher than the Jews that her sleep was often disturbed, she would say, at the thought of how many Arab babies had been born in the night. But the threat comes not only from Arab babies. Non-Jewish African refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants are also violating Israel's right to be Jewish by living in the country and reproducing. Now that we have identified the principal violators of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, and the injury they are causing to Israel merely by procreating, we must ask what remedies Israel could seek and whether any of them is proper. As noted, the threat from Palestinian refugees is dealt with by abrogating their right of return. But what about Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip who would remain uncontrolled violators? The remedies at Israel's disposal would have to include physical and/or other political measures to reverse and prevent further violations of its right to exist as a Jewish state. In theory, these could include the expulsions of Palestinians, a step that would serve the dual purpose of reducing their existing numbers and eliminating the risk of future violations by Palestinian babies who might be born to those expelled. Failing that, Israel could issue restraining orders against Palestinian parents to limit the number of children they are permitted to have, or engage in other practices designed to deter the births of Palestinians and encourage the births of Jews. Similar measures could, of course, be used against other non-Jewish violators as well. Among political or legal measures, Israel could punish and prevent violations by stripping Palestinian citizens of Israel of their right to vote, or by maintaining a separate regime for Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories that allow Jews to get on with running the country without any challenge to their power and control of resources. These are measures that flow naturally from the assertion that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. Yet it is impossible to think of one that does not do outrageous violence to basic principles of human rights, equality, and anti-racism. Yet many of these noxious ideas are already in place or being advocated in Israel. So that lays out the basic argument, and in the rest of the chapter and in other parts of the book, I go through the logic of how Israel is in fact already implementing these policies. And this gets to the core of the correct observation made by John Kerry, that a unitary democratic state, his words, would destroy Israel's ability to be a Jewish state. In other words, we can thank John Kerry for recognizing the fundamental, irreconcilable contradiction between Israel's claim to be a Jewish state and what most of us would understand as democratic and egalitarian principles. This, of course, leads us, as I argue in the book, to the conclusion that there is no such thing as a two-state solution. Yes, I know it exists as a slogan that is repeated constantly, but it is in fact an effort to not to end a conflict or end inequality, but to preserve and legitimize it, to create ethnically or ethno-religiously homogeneous states. And it is, what people call the conflict is the product of that effort, not in the sense that it's the effort to separate people that creates and requires tremendous amounts of violence. Israel could only have been created through massive amounts of violence directed at Palestinians, and it can only be maintained by continuing violence on an enormous scale to keep people ethnically segregated behind walls and fences and so on. And so this leads to good news. I make the argument in the book that this is a depressingly banal situation of settler colonialism. It's not unique. It's not, because it's called the Holy Land, it doesn't, people call it the Holy Land, doesn't mean that there are no parallels and no examples we can learn from. And the closest experiences of decolonization in the present time that we can look at, I argue, are in South Africa and Northern Ireland. And of course, in the time I have, we can get to this in the discussion, I can't go through all the reasoning, but I'll just signal that of course I don't argue that either Northern Ireland or South Africa are utopian examples. In fact, on the contrary, from South Africa we learn about the difficulty and resistance to decolonization. The fact that whereas political apartheid was brought to an end, economic apartheid has been even more deeply entrenched. Nonetheless, one of the key obstacles often cited to decolonization is the claim, I hear this all the time, that it's a non-starter to expect Israelis to submit to democracy and equality and decolonization because the majority of them are against it in the present day, as if any group of colonizers was ever willing to voluntarily give up its power and privileges. And so this is where the importance of resistance comes in, particularly in the global context, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a way to address the power imbalance, to address the feeling Israelis have that they're unassailable and they need not change because they're in a position of strength, and to change their calculus. And what I argue in the book is that when whites in South Africa and Protestants in Northern Ireland perceived that their position was no longer unassailable, that their power was starting to erode, that's the moment when they were prepared to contemplate decolonization. The fact that they continued to resist it in many ways is important, but they were able to make that initial leap from the conviction that giving up power would result in annihilation. They use exactly the same language Israelis use. The term national suicide appears frequently in their discourses, to embracing, in the case of South Africa, going from saying there is no alternative to apartheid, there is no alternative to group rights, to embracing, at least rhetorically, the idea of a what they call a rainbow nation. Of course, I don't ignore the reality that economic inequality, economic apartheid is real. But what I argue in the case of Palestine is we don't need to wait until a post-liberation moment to be disappointed and feel betrayed by economic apartheid and injustice. That reality is already there, and I already mentioned that in the context of neoliberal Palestine. But I'll just close so that we can go to discussion by saying that I really offer this book, and I hope that it will be seen as a very forward-looking and, in a way, optimistic contribution. Omar Barghouti, who is one of the founders of the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, said that it offers educated hope. And that's very much what I had intended to do. In other words, we should not allow the limited, stunted imagination of the official peace process industry and mainstream conventional wisdom that insists on what is impossible and tells us that only very narrow things are possible. We shouldn't be bound by that. This is a moment where people are hungry for a very different discourse, a very different way forward, and where the people who have been telling us the same things for years and years should no longer hold sway over our imagination and over our action. And while I can't give you a time and a date, I'm convinced that the possibility of radical transformation in Palestine, and perhaps even in the broader region, is very real, very live, within our grasp, and it matters fundamentally how we act and what we do, whether we bring it closer or push it further away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali, for this wonderful presentation. Although I think more time should be spent on what's in the book, because the book is so multifaceted in terms of its coverage, especially of the economic situation in Palestine, with regards also to the neoliberalization, the collaboration of the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian businesses, the kind of the new Palestinian colonial settlement of Rawabi that is being built by Palestinian business, all of which I think is of much significance, and also the varieties of the legitimization of the Palestinian solidarity movement, including sort of pinkwashing and greenwashing, the issue of the environment and what that's about, all of which of course is there in an amazing detail in the book with incisive analysis. We will take your questions. There are microphones.
My name is Israel Allen. I'm a student at the School of General Studies. The question that I have is there a way to break the economic inequalities before the political inequalities are broken?
There's a number of contexts for the economic inequalities. The local context is, of course, the colonial situation of occupation, which absolutely determines the economic relationship between Palestinians and Israelis. But of course, there's also the international context, the regional context, which is that Palestine, like all countries, exists within an international order of global neoliberalism and hypercapitalism. And some of what I trace in the book, for example, Professor Massad mentioned Rawabi. This is the luxury housing development near Ramallah that has been heavily marketed in the media as the first planned Palestinian city, and has been marketed with nationalist rhetoric that this is an important step on the path to Palestinian independence and statehood. And the story that I tell about Rawabi is that it's a private development, it's backed by the US government, it's built on land confiscated from Palestinian villages by the Palestinian Authority, using many of the same tactics Israel uses, and it's financed by international capital, in this case, Qatar, $1 billion from Qatar. And also, you have these industrial zones being set up in the West Bank, again with international sponsorship and capital, which are again being marketed using nationalist rhetoric, that this is about creating jobs. When you actually look at the experience of the same kinds of zones in Jordan, they're horrifying. I mean, they're really a kind of slave labor, where people are kept in slave labor camps. And contrary to all the rhetoric, the peace rhetoric, where they were supposed to, bring jobs for local people, it's all people from China and Bangladesh, mostly South Asia and China, who have been brought in, kept in prison-like conditions, and that's being reproduced in Palestine. So part of it is local, but part of it is about putting Palestine back into a global struggle for economic democracy and justice. And in a sense, I wanted to lay those out. I actually say in the book that I don't have all the answers of how you produce that struggle, but I at least wanted to start with an analysis.
Good evening. My name is Roger Crane. I'm also a student at the School of General Studies. And my question was regarding the resistance to decolonization you cited in both Palestine and South Africa. First, I wanted to ask, to what extent racial identity was central to the South African nationalist mythology in the same way that Zionism is central to Israel and Palestine. And as a corollary, I also wanted to ask how central you feel that, that mythology is to the resistance to decolonization.
That's a really good question, and there are probably people who engage in settler colonial studies who could give you a more nuanced answer than I can. But my own reading of the situation is that in all of these cases, Israel, South Africa, Northern Ireland, the ruling group created a narrative in which its rule was fundamental to its identity. And any questioning of its rule was interpreted as an attack on its identity and existence. And this is very clear in Israel, where any questioning of Jewish supremacist rule in historic Palestine is described as, a desire for the destruction of Israel, or now anti-Semitism. So even tying it closer to the note that it's an attack on people's identity. This was very true in Northern Ireland. And I actually go through that in the book, where the narrative, the dominant narrative of unionists, Protestants in Northern Ireland, was that being British and being in control is our identity, and demands by Catholics and nationalists for civil rights and an end to discrimination was always interpreted as an attack on Protestant and British identity. And you see similar things in South Africa. So part of the process of decolonization is for the ruling group to be able to tell itself a different story. And I think Northern Ireland is an interesting example of that, because the thing that was always celebrated as Protestant culture in Northern Ireland was the defeat and denigration of Catholics. So you go around areas of Belfast and you see these murals of 16th and 17th century battles of Catholics being brutally slaughtered. And so there's a conscious effort to replace that with a cultural identity that is shorn of bigotry. And that includes things like, for example, celebrating the Titanic. So in Belfast there's been a very yes, the Titanic sunk. I get that, but there's been a very conscious effort to provide an alternative narrative that draws on different historical sources. And in the book, I cite the South African scholar Stephen Friedman, who predicts or projects Israeli Jews reaching for different traditions within Judaism, which would allow them to produce a Zionist or post-colonial narrative, which is not about domination of the land and of the people in it. So I think that part of decolonization is fascinating to me, and I think we can learn a lot. I talk in the book about Ian Paisley, the most bigoted anti-Catholic demagogue, who just was always inciting against Catholics, but who, after he embraced the peace agreement, began talking about a shared history. He'd never spoken about a shared history in the past. So the case I make is that people's narratives that seem so solid and immovable when they're in power change very rapidly once their power starts to slip away and once circumstances require them to accommodate to a new reality. So the bottom line is I don't see those narratives themselves as obstacles to change, but as products of a power imbalance.
And then I heard something the other day that I thought was a kind of surprising idea that might mess everything up in a beautiful manner. A gentleman who is now, he's a professor at Tel Aviv University. Yes. And in conversation, he said something, well, he thinks the right of return should only exist for Sephardic Jews.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about the earlier binational?
Well, Yeah, sure. And I'll just briefly, I mean, even early sort of Zionist politicians who might have had more of a binational idea, at the end of the day, they still believed in the right of Jewish colonization of Palestine. So the fact and what they wanted to equalize is the rights of colonists with the right to colonize with indigenous populations. So it was still a colonial effort, even if it was less drastic than the later one. So from an anti-colonial perspective, I'm not sure I would look very favorably on that, although of course I can make distinctions between that kind of Zionist project and a different one. As far as the Sephardi question is concerned, as you probably know, the Palestine Liberation Organization in the mid-1970s, after it was recognized internationally and came to being, in fact demanded of all the Arab governments that had a Jewish population that had left to offer all the Arab Jews to come back to their countries to restore their nationality and their property. And remember, all the Arab governments that were in power in the mid-1970s had not been the ones who were in power when the Arab Jews had left. Those governments were in fact under French and British colonial and/or imperial authority. And indeed, the Arab governments did make that offer, and this includes Libya, Sudan, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, and Morocco at the time. The Arab Jews of Israel did not take up these governments on the offer. But nonetheless, of course, Palestinians have always been in the forefront of the struggle and understood that the displacement of Arab Jews, even if in more sort of in a less coercive manner than what happened to the Palestinians, some of them left because of concern and threats. Others, Israel had organized their displacement through attacks on their communities. But this aside, of course, the Palestinians have been invested in their return and felt that those Arab governments who facilitated their departure had been collaborators with Zionism in Israel in the displacement of the Palestinians. You all could have some questions to that. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Itamar. I'm a senior student. I'm from Israel. I listened to your talk. I have to say, when I came here, I thought I would disagree with you on every point, but I agree with you in some points. I didn't hear in your talk, where do you think this is going? Are we going to another 100 years of conflict, violence? And maybe a second point, we talk about struggle. I know BDS is very popular. Do you think that will achieve anything in the long run? So these are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar. Well, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what will happen. What I try to argue in the book, though, is that we should not be resigned to a situation where, because the past has been dismal, that the future must also be dismal. That the possibility of transformation is real. It does require a change in the way many of us think. And it does require action. And I do believe that when you have such a vast power imbalance, simply asking nicely is not going to get you very far. And Palestinians have a right to struggle, they have a right to resist, they have a responsibility to determine for themselves what is the right means of struggle. And I think that the BDS movement has been a very significant factor in recent years. It's exceeded the expectations of some. I mean, we've seen people who are even involved in the Palestinian national movement who are very either opposed to BDS or skeptical or uncommitted, very recently coming on board because it exceeded their expectations. And the key point is that we know that there's been very significant grassroots support around the world for the Palestinians and for Palestinian rights, but very few means to mobilize it. And BDS has offered a sustained way to mobilize that support to such an extent that Israel now defines it as a significant strategic threat. And in the book I talk about all the ways that Israel has mobilized against it. Part of it is about changing the discourse. It's not simply about, affecting Israel's economy or, it's also about changing the calculus. And we know in South Africa, the sporting boycott was considered one of the most significant, even though not playing in international sporting events is hardly fatal to a country. It had a very significant effect on South African white opinion. And if you read the Israeli media, which I'm sure you do, there is this panic about isolation and about Israel becoming a pariah that perhaps exceeds, at this point, the reality. But that's how it works. It works by creating a different calculus. Of course, this has to be, BDS is led by Palestinians, it was initiated by Palestinians, it was led by them. It's something that even some Israelis are in solidarity with. There are groups like Boycott from Within and Anarchists Against the Wall that are fully on board with BDS. But there are also other forms of Palestinian struggle on the ground, including now prisoners who are again on hunger strike against the cruel and sadistic treatment that Israel metes out to them in prison. There are still protests on the ground, but this is all in the context that, part of what has happened over the past 20 years is a systematic effort by Israel, the so-called international community, and the Palestinian Authority collaborating with it to destroy any capacity to resist among Palestinians. So the possibilities for mass action within Palestine that existed during the First Intifada or even the Second Intifada are more limited now. Perhaps that will change. And perhaps that means that, in a sense, the burden has shifted for the time being to campaigns outside, if that makes sense. But I hope you'll read the book, because I do think that the situation is more fluid and more open than people expect. But there are those like Meron Benvenisti who argue that the reality of apartheid is actually stable and could last for decades. I think if that's true, we should do all we can to destabilize it.
My name is Marcin. I'm a student at Columbia College. To continue with the last point about activism outside of Palestine, Israel proper, do you think that BDS should maybe focus a little bit more on educational efforts and maybe also direct political action in America? Because if you look at the comparison in South Africa, the congressional sanctions, for example, and just the whole campaign in America were extremely important in bringing international opposition. So do you think that this should be pursued in addition to economic sanctions against Israel?
Well, every good BDS campaign should first and foremost be an educational campaign, because BDS is a form of discourse. It's about putting issues in front of people that have been marginalized. The whole so-called peace process discourse has been about Israeli security and maintaining Israel's Jewish character. Those are the concerns of the official peace process. What BDS does is it puts the rights of Palestinians that are violated by Israel back at the center. And so a BDS campaign is an educational campaign. What I argue in the book, I didn't mention it in my remarks, but I'll just take this opportunity to say it, is that I argue that at least here in the United States, we have to be very aware and connected to our context. That we cannot be sitting here addressing simply a situation that is thousands of miles away, albeit one that the United States is directly involved in, without being part of the struggle against racism and for social justice in this country. I mean, the question that comes up time and again, you hear this all the time when the US votes against resolutions, in the UN, and it's the only country vetoing resolutions regarding Israel's abuses. How can the US be so hypocritical? How can it talk about democracy and human rights and yet allow Israel to get away with this? Well, the question is really, how can the United States be so hypocritical talking about democracy and human rights when we have mass incarceration in this country, when we have Jim Crow in this country, when this administration, the Obama administration, has deported 2 million people. That's more people deported from this country by Obama than by all previous administrations combined. How can this country talk about human rights when this president is the first to openly keep a kill list of people that he wants to extrajudicially murder? So I make the case in the book that these connections are ideological. The same outlook that produces mass incarceration in the new Jim Crow is what produces Palestinians as a demographic threat to Israel. And the links are organic. So when you talk about activism and campaigns, I've been to many campuses where students are organizing around divestment from prisons, divestment from fossil fuels, and Palestine solidarity activism, divestment from companies profiting from the occupation. But seldom are these campaigns connected. And they should be connected, given that, for example, you take a firm like G4S, which runs prisons, juvenile detention centers in this country, and also runs and helps Israel run detention centers like Al-Jalama in the occupied West Bank and Megiddo prison, where Palestinian children are held in solitary confinement, are tortured, where Arafat Jaradat, a 30-year-old Palestinian father of two, was tortured to death last year. G4S is profiting from Israeli racism and apartheid there, and from American apartheid and racism here. So, when your enemy is working the same, I also talk about, on my way here, I saw an NYPD squad car run over a cyclist. Luckily, he wasn't seriously injured, but I stayed on the scene because I worried they would arrest him. And I made sure I went and talked to him. I asked the cops, I said, are you giving him a ticket? I stayed with him and gave him my information in case he needed a witness, because I saw them hit him and they were going through a red light. In any case, the reason I mention this is because the NYPD's program of spying on Muslims, which they have now renamed as something else, I don't know what the new name for it is openly modeled. The CIA agent who designed it for the NYPD, a guy called Larry Sanchez, said that he modeled it on Israel's methods of controlling Palestinians in the West Bank. So the organic connections, the conveyor belt of US police chiefs going to Israel and visiting places like Megiddo prison, the massive multi-billion-dollar homeland security industry, where Israel is selling its racial profiling, its technologies of oppression tested on Palestinian guinea pigs in Gaza and the West Bank, is not going to be defeated unless people are talking to each other, have a joint analysis, and mounting joint campaigns. Because it's very easy for universities to marginalize Palestine solidarity activists. It's much harder for them to marginalize a broad coalition that is talking about all of these issues together.
My name is Zim, and I'm a student here, undergrad. I'm wondering, how important this or how far, changing public opinion in America goes. Beyond, say, having a psychological impact on people in Israel. When you look at political action, for example, there's so much money going on in electoral politics that I don't think any candidate is gonna, stand up and say, this thing has to be stopped. Definitely there's a lot of funding from pro-Israel groups. So, what is your take on that?
I'm not very convinced that, the traditional model that we're taught in civics class, that if we all write and call our Congress members, that they're going to do what we want. I think that, but nonetheless, I think grassroots pressure and a change in how people think does have an impact. I mean, you know, an example that will probably worry Israel lobby groups is the sea change in opinion on same-sex marriage in this country. Now, I don't say, you know, of course, one can criticize that from many angles, including progressive angles, that it's ultimately a conservative or neo-liberal agenda to co-opt LGBTQ activism into marriage and so on. But setting that aside, this was a position that, you know, a decade ago, overwhelmingly was opposed by the American public, by large majorities, and very few people would have predicted that, you know, within 10 years, it would be a commonplace. And so that kind of change can happen. And I think that the analysis I give in the book is where Israel and pro-Israel groups see that sort of erosion of support is among people under 30 in this country. It's a younger, it's a more multicultural, it's a more liberal and open demographic, and it's the base of the Democratic Party. Of course, if you ask me the difference between Obama and his chief Republican rivals, I would probably tell you Obama is worse because of his impact in demobilizing resistance and opposition. However, at the base of the people who actually vote, they do differ very significantly in their outlook from the Republican base. And there you see a very significant shift in opinion happening on Israel. And that's significant because that's the demographic that's ascendant. It's younger, again, it's more racially and ethnically diverse and so on. So I don't think we can discount the impact, even in the scale of 5 or 10 years.
All right, I think we will, do you have a question or a quick one?
Yeah.
I think we want to stop, I believe. And just to let you know, of course, before I thank Andy, the book is available outside. Andy will be happy to sign a copy for you. Thank you all for coming, Andy. Thank you for this wonderful